I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this very important and timely hearing on the 2021 wildfire season. We have all seen the heartbreaking footage of the wildfires that continue to rage in the West and have been raging in the West so far this year. The fires are terrifying, and I stand ready to do whatever I can as chair of this subcommittee to ensure that the Forest Service has the resources, the personnel, and the tools they need to prepare for future fires and respond to the wildland fires already raging. It is also imperative that we make sure firefighters on the ground are compensated fairly and given adequate time away from this intense and dangerous work. And I think I speak for everyone here today when I say that America's firefighters embody our nation's highest ideals of courage, commitment, and selflessness towards their fellow Americans. Unfortunately, as we head into the heart of wildfire season, or as it's become wildfire years after years, we are expected to have yet another unprecedented year of dangerous and deadly wildfires ahead of us. And as we speak, there are currently more than 60 wildfires raging in the United States across 3 million acres of land, and in much of the land represented by some of the members of this subcommittee and certainly members of the larger committee. While the volume of wildfires may be unprecedented, the story before us is a familiar one. In the short time that I've chaired this subcommittee, I've presided over a wildfire hearing each year that begins with news exactly about what has happened in that year's wildfire season, and each year it's worse than the last. In fact, it was almost exactly a year ago that we sat here and had a hearing nearly identical as the Rattlesnake, the Creek, the SCU lighting complex, and the El Dorado fires, among others, devastated the western United States. And at that hearing, I compared the situation in the West to another environmental crisis that faced much of the United States in the 1930s, the Dust Bowl. And during that period, there was a sense that Congress did not understand the severity of the problems facing America's farmers and families living in the midst of an environmental crisis. And despite demands for action by both the administration and those impacted by the dust storm for years, Congress failed to act in a comprehensive manner, and it was not until March of 1935 when the dust from the Midwest reached the Capitol steps and lawmakers were forced to see it and experience it with their own eyes that a compromise could be reached on what became the first federal conservation bill, the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act of 1936. It should not take the ash of these wildfires or the debris and floodwaters of hurricanes ravaging our coast or the severe heat felt by millions across the nation and across the globe on a daily basis. It should not take that reaching the Capitol steps for us, for Congress, to take action on the environmental crisis we're currently facing. Through the House Agriculture Committee section of the proposed Build Back Better Act, the committee is taking action. This bill, marked up by this committee just a few weeks ago, contains $14 billion for hazardous fuel treatments on national forest system lands, $1 billion for critical vegetation management, $9 billion in grants for state and private forestry for hazardous fuel treatments, millions of dollars in grants for recovery and rehabilitation of areas affected by wildfires, $50 million for post-fire recovery plans, and would remove the cap on the Reforestation Trust Fund, building on the Replant Act, which was introduced by our colleague, Congressman Panetta, who serves on this subcommittee. And this is a piece of legislation that I'm proud to co-lead, and I know the ranking member is also a co-lead of this important legislation. What's more, this bill squarely takes aim at combating the crisis by investing in clean energy jobs, climate-smart conservation practices at USDA, and the creation of a civilian climate corps, as called for in my bill, the Climate Stewardship Act. Of course, climate is not the only factor contributing to the intensity of wildfires and the wildfire seasons. We know that many factors are involved in the current wildfires and our wildfire risk. Encroachment of housing developments on forested wildlands, forest management decisions and resources, fire management, weather events, the actions of people, like the use of pyrotechnic devices, and the list unfortunately continues. In addition, there's still more that must be done to protect Americans from wildfires, make impacted communities whole, and ensure the U.S. Forest Service has the tools they need to respond to and combat wildfires, all while combating the climate crisis. Managing our forests to mitigate future wildfire risk is a steep but not insurmountable task, and former Fire Service Chief Vicki Christensen testified recently that we need to treat an additional 20 million acres of forest lands over the next 10 years to make progress in reducing our wildfire risk. I am looking forward to the conversation about how we can make that happen. And before we begin the discussion, I do want to congratulate Randy Moore on his new role as Chief of the U.S. Forest Service. As a regional forester, Chief Moore has been a leader among his peers on issues relating to conservation, combating the climate crisis, responding to wildfires. Chief Moore's appointment to this role is historic. He's also the first African American to hold this role in the history of the United States Forest Service. I was excited to have a chance to speak with Chief Moore in advance of this hearing, learn about some of his experiences, the places he's worked throughout the United States, and I look forward to hearing more from him today. I have the utmost confidence in his leadership and the vision that he brings to the U.S. Forest Service, and I appreciate him joining us today to answer our questions. With that, I thank our speaker for joining us. I look forward to the discussion, and I'll now recognize the ranking member for any remarks that he'd like to make at the outset of this hearing.